And to lose your mom at 14 is, not easy.
When you see Paul McCartney on stage today, you see a legend with that familiar warm smile and timeless melodies that defined generations. But behind that polished exterior lies a man who is deeply vulnerable and extraordinarily sensitive to criticism. For decades, Paul McCartney has been the nice Beatle, the diplomat, the peacemaker, the one who always seemed above petty feuds. But recently, in a rare moment of candor, McCartney revealed something he's kept hidden for over 60 years, a personal blacklist of people he truly despises. This isn't just celebrity gossip. This is about betrayal at the highest levels of the music industry, about friendships destroyed by greed, artistic vision corrupted by ego, and legacy tainted by violence. On this list, a musical prodigy who stabbed him in the back over song rights, a soulmate whose love affair destroyed the world's greatest band, a deranged killer who stole any chance of reconciliation, and a smooth-talking businessman who legally dismantled the Beatles piece by piece. Who are these people? And why has McCartney, a man worth over $1 billion and one of the most successful musicians in history, carried these grudges in silence for so long? The answer reveals not just the dark side of fame, but the incredible price of maintaining a legend. Paul McCartney wasn't born into privilege. Growing up in working-class Liverpool in 1942, his world shattered when his mother, Mary, died of breast cancer when he was just 14. That loss carved something deep into his soul, a desperate need for control, for perfection, for making sure nothing he loved could be taken away again. Music became his escape, his weapon, his shield. When he met John Lennon in 1957, something electric happened. Two wounded boys from Liverpool discovered they could create magic together. Add George Harrison and Ringo Starr, and the Beatles were born. But here's what the fairy tale doesn't tell you. Paul McCartney was never the easygoing musician the world believed him to be. He was a relentless perfectionist who would force the band to record a single passage dozens of times. He was ambitious to a fault, desperately wanting to be seen as John's equal, or better. George Harrison once said working with Paul was like having your hands tied. John Lennon wrote an entire song mocking him. Even Ringo, the most diplomatic Beatle, admitted Paul could be difficult. This perfectionism created immortal music, but it also bred deep resentment. And when the Beatles began to crumble in the late 1960s, McCartney's desperate attempts to hold everything together would earn him enemies he'd carry to his grave. By 1970, the most successful band in history was dead, but the wars were just beginning. Enemy number one, Michael Jackson. The betrayal that changed everything. In 1982, Paul McCartney was at the top of his solo career when he struck up an unlikely friendship with a young superstar named Michael Jackson. They were from different worlds. Paul, the seasoned Beatle, Michael, the king of pop, but they connected over their shared love of music and performance. They collaborated on hits like Say, Say, Say and The Girl Is Mine. Michael looked up to Paul like an older brother, often calling him for advice about the music business. And Paul, perhaps seeing something of his younger self in Michael's ambition, was generous with his wisdom. During one of their conversations, Paul shared what he called the secret to lasting wealth in music. Buy publishing rights, own the songs, and you'll have income forever. Paul had been quietly purchasing catalogs of other artists' work, including Buddy Holly's songs. It was smart business, he explained to Michael. What Paul didn't expect was that Michael Jackson was taking notes. In 1985, ATV Music Publishing, the company that owned the rights to most Beatles songs, went up for auction. Paul McCartney, the man who had co-written these songs, naturally assumed he'd buy them back. But he was outbid by his friend Michael Jackson, who paid $47.5 million for the catalog. Paul felt like he'd been shot by his own student. The advice he'd given Michael in confidence had been turned against him. Songs like Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Let It Be, pieces of Paul's soul, now belonged to someone else. The betrayal ran deeper than money. When Michael faced financial trouble years later, many expected him to sell the catalog back to Paul. Instead, Michael partnered with Sony, holding on to the Beatles' legacy until his death. Paul has never forgiven him. In interviews, his voice still carries the sting of that betrayal. I thought we were friends, but Michael turned it into a business deal. For Paul McCartney, Michael Jackson represents the ultimate lesson in trust betrayed and the price of sharing secrets with the wrong person. Enemy number 2, John Lennon, from soulmates to public warfare. If Michael Jackson's betrayal was about money, John Lennon's was about something far more precious, the brotherhood that created the Beatles. Paul and John were more than songwriting partners. They were kindred spirits who understood each other's musical DNA. The Lennon-McCartney credit became legendary, even though by the mid-1960s they were writing most songs individually. But success poisoned their friendship. John hated the cute Beatle image Paul was cultivating. Paul was frustrated by John's increasingly erratic behavior and drug use. When their manager Brian Epstein died in 1967, the band had no anchor, and the two leaders began fighting for control. The breaking point came when John fell in love with Yoko Ono. Suddenly, the man who had been Paul's creative equal was taking orders from his girlfriend. Band meetings became battlegrounds. Recording sessions turned toxic. When the Beatles finally imploded, Paul made a desperate move. He sued his 3 bandmates in court to dissolve their business partnership. To John, this felt like the ultimate betrayal. John's revenge was swift and brutal. In 1971, he released How Do You Sleep?, a musical assassination attempt aimed directly at Paul's heart. The lyrics were vicious. "The only thing you did was yesterday," reducing Paul's entire catalog to one song. "Those freaks were right when they said you were dead," referencing the Paul is dead conspiracy theories. Paul was devastated. For years afterward, he'd mentioned the song in interviews with obvious pain. It was hurtful to hear John singing that. Paul fired back with Too Many People, a subtle but sharp attack on John and Yoko. "You took your lucky break and broke it in two." But then fate intervened. On December 8, 1980, as their feud was finally cooling down, they'd even started talking about possibly working together again, John Lennon was murdered outside his New York apartment. For Paul, John's death didn't just end their friendship. It ended any chance of redemption. The last words between the two greatest songwriters of their generation were insults disguised as music. Enemy number 3, Mark David Chapman, the man who stole reconciliation. Mark David Chapman didn't just kill John Lennon, he murdered Paul McCartney's last chance at peace with his greatest collaborator. December 8, 1980, started like any other day for the obsessed Beatles fan from Hawaii. Chapman had flown to New York with one purpose: to meet John Lennon. He waited outside the Dakota building with a copy of Double Fantasy, John's new album with Yoko. When John emerged that morning, Chapman approached politely. John signed the album, smiled, and walked away, completely unaware that he'd just shaken hands with his future killer. That evening, when John and Yoko returned home, Chapman was waiting in the shadows. As John walked toward the building entrance, Chapman called out, "Mr. Lennon," and fired 5 shots. 4 hit their target. John Lennon died at Roosevelt Hospital 20 minutes later. When Paul heard the news, he was in shock. Leaving his recording studio, he was ambushed by reporters shouting questions. Flustered and trying not to break down on camera, Paul managed only, "It's a drag." Those 3 words haunted him for years. Headlines screamed about McCartney's cold reaction to Lennon's death. Fans accused him of celebrating his former partner's murder. But Paul's pain went deeper than public misunderstanding. Just weeks before his death, John had started talking about reconciling with Paul. They'd had friendly phone conversations for the first time in years. There were whispers about a possible reunion. All of them died with 5 gunshots in Manhattan. For Paul, Mark David Chapman isn't just John's killer. He's the man who stole their story's redemption. Every Beatles documentary, every Hall of Fame induction, every anniversary celebration is a reminder that the 4 of them will never share a stage again. Paul has never spoken Chapman's name in public without venom. He calls him a coward, a damn psycho. Because Chapman didn't just take John's life, he took Paul's chance to say, "I'm sorry," and mean it. Enemy number 4, Yoko Ono. The woman who changed everything before 1968, the Beatles recording studio was sacred ground. Just 4 lads from Liverpool making the music that would define a generation. Then John Lennon brought Yoko Ono to a session, and everything changed forever. Yoko wasn't content to sit quietly in the corner. She had opinions about the music, suggestions for the arrangements, ideas for the artistic direction. For Paul McCartney, a control freak who micromanaged every detail, this was unbearable. "I don't resent Yoko for being with John," Paul later admitted, "but I hate the way things changed once she appeared." The chemistry between John and Paul, built over a decade of shared creativity, began to dissolve. John stopped being Paul's musical equal and became Yoko's artistic partner. The intimate democracy of the Beatles became a power struggle with an outsider at the table. When the Beatles broke up, Paul didn't hide his feelings. He blamed Yoko for changing John, for influencing his decisions, for putting her relationship above the band's legacy. Yoko fought back with equal venom. She publicly dismissed Paul's songwriting as empty entertainment music compared to John's deeper artistry. In a 1981 Rolling Stone poll, she voted Paul the least important Beatle. The war escalated over songwriting credits. All Beatles songs were credited as Lennon-McCartney, regardless of who actually wrote them. After John's death, when Paul suggested changing some credits to McCartney-Lennon for songs he'd written alone, Yoko exploded. "She wants to rewrite history in a way that benefits her and John," Paul said bitterly. "But I can't let that happen." The legal battles dragged on for years. Paul accused Yoko of trying to diminish his legacy. Yoko accused Paul of exploiting John's death for personal gain. They eventually reached a cold peace in the 1990s during the Beatles anthology project. But Paul has never truly forgiven her. In his mind, Yoko Ono didn't just break up the Beatles, she stole his best friend and turned him into a stranger. Enemy number 5, George Harrison. The Quiet Rebellion. The tragedy of George Harrison and Paul McCartney's relationship wasn't hatred, it was suffocation. George was the Beatles' youngest member, joining when he was just 14 years old. For years, he accepted his role as the junior partner, content to play Paul and John's musical arrangements without complaint. But as George matured as a musician and songwriter, Paul's perfectionist control became unbearable. In the studio, Paul would dictate every guitar note, every vocal harmony, every instrumental choice. George felt like a session musician in his own band. The breaking point came during the recording of Let It Be. Paul kept asking George to replay a guitar part over and over, never satisfied with the performance. The atmosphere grew so toxic that George simply stood up, announced "I'm leaving," and walked out. It wasn't the first time. Throughout the Beatles' later albums, George's carefully crafted guitar solos were repeatedly rejected or rewritten by Paul. His songwriting contributions were minimized or dismissed. "Working with Paul is like having your hands tied," George said in one of his rare public criticisms. "He always thinks he knows everything." Even after the Beatles split, the tension continued. George and Paul clashed over business decisions, royalty splits, and creative control of Apple Corps, their shared company. The tragedy is that Paul's tyrannical perfectionism came from love. He wanted every Beatles song to be perfect because he cared so deeply about the music. But George experienced it as artistic imprisonment. Unlike his battles with John or Yoko, Paul couldn't dismiss George as an outsider. George was family, the little brother who'd grown up and demanded respect that Paul couldn't bring himself to give. Their relationship remained politely cold until George's death in 2001. At the funeral, Paul wept openly, perhaps finally understanding that his need for control had cost him another brother. Enemy number 6. Alan Klein, the smooth-talking destroyer. After Brian Epstein's death in 1967, the Beatles were like 4 talented children running a billion-dollar business. They needed a manager, and they needed one fast. Enter Alan Klein, a street-smart New Yorker with a reputation for squeezing record companies until they bled money for his clients. He'd managed the Rolling Stones and Sam Cooke, positioning himself as the artist's champion against corporate greed. Klein was charismatic, persuasive, and told the Beatles exactly what they wanted to hear, that they were being ripped off, and he could make them richer than ever. John, George, and Ringo were sold immediately. Klein spoke their language. He was direct, aggressive, and promised to fight their battles. But Paul was suspicious. Klein seemed too smooth, too eager, too good to be true. Paul wanted the Beatles to work with Eastman and Eastman, his wife Linda's family law firm, because he trusted them. The other 3 Beatles saw this as Paul trying to install his in-laws as their bosses. In 1969, they voted 3-1 to hire Klein, leaving Paul completely shut out of the band's financial decisions. Klein immediately began restructuring Apple Corps, firing employees and cutting costs. Short-term profits increased, making him look like a genius. But Paul's instincts were right. Klein was skimming money from the band, taking higher commissions than agreed, and secretly keeping royalty payments that belonged to the artists. In desperation, Paul did something unthinkable. On December 31st, 1970, he sued John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr to dissolve the Beatles and escape Klein's control. The world was outraged. Headlines screamed that Paul McCartney had killed the Beatles. Fans turned against him. His former bandmates felt betrayed. But Paul was vindicated a few years later when Klein was exposed as a fraud. He was found guilty of tax evasion and forced to repay the Beatles over $800,000. John, George, and Ringo eventually admitted Paul had been right to oppose Klein. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The Beatles were finished, and there was no going back. For Paul, Alan Klein represents more than just a crooked manager. He's the man who forced him to choose between his friendships and his artistic integrity. And he's never forgiven his bandmates for making him the villain when he was trying to save them all. Enemy number 7, Phil Spector, the producer who butchered a masterpiece. By 1970, the Beatles were falling apart, but they had one final album to complete, Let It Be, originally called the Get Back Project. Paul's vision was simple and pure: strip away the studio tricks and orchestrations that had defined their recent work and return to their roots as a rock and roll band. Raw, honest, authentic. Then Alan Klein brought in Phil Spector to rescue the project. Phil Spector was famous for his wall of sound, dense, layered productions that hit listeners like a musical tsunami. Everything he touched became bigger, louder, more dramatic. But that's exactly what Paul didn't want. When Spector got his hands on Paul's ballad, The Long and Winding Road, he turned it into a Vegas spectacular. He added a full symphony orchestra, a gospel choir, brass sections, and string arrangements. The intimate, melancholy song that Paul had crafted was buried under layers of musical bombast. Paul was furious. He immediately wrote a letter to Klein and Spector. "Don't ever do it again. Get the strings off, get the brass off, get all that noisy stuff off." They ignored him completely. When Let It Be was released in May 1970, Paul's song topped the American charts. But for Paul, it was a hollow victory. The song that reached #1 wasn't his song. It was Phil Spector's interpretation of his song. Even George Martin, the Beatles' longtime producer, was disgusted. He suggested the album should be credited. Produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector. Spector showed no remorse. "Paul has been performing my arrangement for decades," he said arrogantly. "If he wants to start a war, he's picked the wrong opponent." For over 30 years, Paul carried this wound. Then in 2003, he finally got his revenge. Let It Be Naked was Paul's restoration of the original album, stripped of all Spector's additions. The long and winding road returned to its intended form. Just Paul's voice and piano, raw and beautiful. It was more than an album. It was Paul's declaration of artistic independence, his music, his way, his legacy. Enemy number 8, Frank Sinatra, the legend who never got it. Frank Sinatra represented everything Paul McCartney initially admired about American popular music: sophistication, style, timeless class. When the Beatles conquered America in 1964, there was mutual respect between the old guard and the new wave. But as rock and roll grew more dominant, Sinatra's attitude soured. He publicly dismissed rock music as garbage and noise for rebellious kids. For Paul, who had helped create the sound that defined a generation, these weren't just criticisms. They were declarations of war. The final straw came when Sinatra mocked "Yesterday," one of Paul's most personal compositions, calling it the saddest song ever written, in a tone that made clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. But Sinatra's most insulting moment was accidental. During a performance, he introduced George Harrison's "Something" as the best love song Lennon and McCartney ever wrote. It was a seemingly harmless mistake, but it revealed everything Paul suspected about Sinatra's attitude toward the Beatles. To Frank, they weren't individual artists worthy of respect. They were just those rock and roll kids whose music was interchangeable. For Paul, who had spent his career fighting to be recognized as a serious composer, Sinatra's dismissiveness was particularly galling. Here was a man Paul had admired, treating his life's work as disposable pop culture. The mutual contempt never exploded into public warfare, but it created a permanent crack in Paul's view of his musical heroes. If Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the voice of American popular music, couldn't respect what the Beatles had accomplished, then maybe the establishment would never truly accept rock and roll as legitimate art. Why silent? The price of being a legend. So why has Paul McCartney kept this hateless secret for so long? Why hasn't he publicly settled scores with his enemies? The answer reveals the sophisticated psychology of maintaining a legend. First, image is everything. Paul McCartney isn't just a musician. He's a brand worth over $1 billion. He's the nice Beatle, the diplomat, the one who brings people together through music. If he suddenly revealed himself as a bitter, grudge-holding old man, that carefully crafted image would crumble overnight. Second, the Beatles' legacy is bigger than any individual grievance. The band represents peace, love, and unity to millions of fans worldwide. If Paul publicly attacked John's memory, or Yoko's reputation, or George's contributions, he'd be destroying something more precious than his personal satisfaction. He'd be shattering a myth that gives people hope. Third, many of his enemies are dead. John, George, Frank Sinatra, Phil Spector, they can't defend themselves. Attacking them now would make Paul look petty and cowardly, not vindicated. Fourth, Paul understands the power of music over words. Rather than holding press conferences to air his grievances, he's embedded his anger in songs. Too many people attacked John and Yoko. Let It Be, Naked, was his answer to Phil Spector. The music carries his revenge more eloquently than any interview could. Finally, Paul is playing the long game. He's 81 years old now, and he wants to be remembered as an artist who chose love over hatred, forgiveness over bitterness. His silence isn't weakness, it's strategic grace. But here's the paradox. By keeping his hateless secret all these years, Paul has created an even more powerful narrative. The revelation of his hidden grudges doesn't make him seem petty. It makes him seem human. We see the man behind the myth, the wounded artist behind the cheerful public face. And somehow, that makes his music even more meaningful. Paul McCartney's secret hate list reveals something profound about fame, friendship, and forgiveness. These 8 people, Michael Jackson, John Lennon, Mark David Chapman, Yoko Ono, George Harrison, Alan Klein, Phil Spector, and Frank Sinatra, each represent a different kind of betrayal, a different wound that never fully healed. But Paul's ultimate revenge wasn't public confrontation or legal warfare. It was outlasting them all. While his enemies died or faded from relevance, Paul kept making music, kept performing, kept creating joy for millions of fans. Today, when people hear Yesterday or Hey Jude or Let It Be, they don't think about the battles behind the songs. They think about love, hope, and the power of music to heal. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Paul McCartney's hate list. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let hatred define you. Sometimes the greatest victory is choosing to be remembered for what you created, not what you destroyed. And maybe that's why, even at 81, Paul McCartney is still here, still singing, still creating, still believing that in the end, love is all you need.